Hey there, students. So, in part four of our book, we're going to be looking at the construction of deviance, or the process in which a particular behavior has a moral meaning attached to it, and how these definitions are created and applied and really work against really certain groups. And so, there's a power dynamic associated with this as well. Um, Here I have an example of Reefer Madness. If you do the research, you'll find that Reefer Madness was a film that came out in the 1920s or 30s, but it really worked to demonize marijuana, and it gave people the perception that marijuana was this awful drug and you were going to go kill your mother. In fact, they show someone hitting their mother with a frying pan, and it really amplified and demonized, marijuana at the time. It's also really important to look at the sociology of it, or what's happening underneath. So keep in mind that during this time, hemp was a very versatile textile product. So hemp is, what's used to make textiles, and so very, very strong. And it was a threat to the cotton industry and other industries at that time. So, if people in power could demonize marijuana, they could also monopolize the hemp industry. And so it's just really, really important to understand that oftentimes there's other things going on here. And so hopefully, after this short lecture, you'll be able to, reflect and think about other types of moral panics and ways in which we've seen deviance constructed historically. So again, in terms of looking at how deviance is constructed, we're looking at the process in which deviant definitions are created and how they are applied to certain groups. It's also important to consider that obviously the groups that they're applied to are oftentimes people who have, not as much power as others for whatever reasons, and we'll talk about that in a second. But generally, what's happening is people are attaching a moral meaning to a specific act, saying that somehow, our fabric of society is going to unravel if we continue to let these kind of acts happen. And the process is generally, and it happens especially now in terms of the media, where you have moral entrepreneurs kind of coming on the news saying, hey, we have a real problem. This is what we're going to do to, help the problem or whatever. Historically, we've seen this happen all the time, right? So the little picture here that I have, this looked at the book that Stanley Cohen, who is one of my favorite sociologists, he coined the terms folk double and moral panics to look at this process in which, like, certain individuals are targeted and labeled as, causing, the issues in our society. So again, we've seen this throughout history. Stanley Cohen looked at, he was from Britain, and he looked at two groups. They were known as the mods and the rockers. And the mods, it was really about music and fashion. And he said these two groups came together. The mods had these little motorcycles called Vespas, and they dressed in like suits and they listened to ska. I'm not sure if you guys even know what that is anymore. Google it. And then the rockers, these guys were more like greasers. And it was about music and about fashion. And both of these groups were kind of lower income, working class kids who had just, the economy was going really well. They were kind of getting a little bit of money so they could kind of show their fashion. And so it all this particular event, these two groups got together. There was a little bit of friction. There was some fighting. But what ended up happening was the media amplified it as this like major issue that happened, where there were these big kind of riots amongst these two groups. And when Stanley Cohen actually went and investigated, he found that that just wasn't true. Yeah, there was some kind of ruffling happening in terms of like fighting, but for the most part, this wasn't something, that needed to be framed in this way. And it was like, and what ends up happening is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then these moral entrepreneurs or cops and rule creators and rule enforcers come, and they're like, hey, we need to like lock these people up. They're a real threat to the society. And so we've seen this happen over and over and over again. In the US, we saw it happen with alcohol, and, during Prohibition, where, alcoholism was seen as, this thing that was really going to unravel the moral fabric, or marijuana, or the war on drugs, which is where we also saw it. We saw young black men demonized as being super predators, right? And don't worry, we will lock them up, and we will, um, again, produce really tough on crime like laws and things like that. And so it comes to be this self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's a really, really interesting phenomenon. And I hope that as you learn this, you can start to see we have moral panics happening all the time. Some of the ones I've seen recently, that with anti-immigration sentiment, when Trump called immigrants from Mexico rapists and murderers, it really created this panic. And look what happened. We built this wall. Um, and so you're seeing this kind of stuff all the time, or, video games causing so much violence. And you'll see it one way or the other, both on the conservative side and more of the liberal side, where, they're really creating this kind of panic. And it leads to fear. And I think that's a really, really important thing to think about, right? But it's also, again, becomes a self fulfilling prophecy, because then people go and they vote on crime laws or other types of policies that they think are going to, help them. So generally, the process kind of happens again. You have the moral entrepreneurs who are making the claims and using experts to validate these points that they're making, which leads to a moral conversion from the society or from the public. And again, it creates these folk doubles, these people who are really scapegoated by the society as being really the reason for most of our problems. So here, the other aspect of creating deviance and defining it looks at the power dynamics. And of course, those without the power within a particular society or culture are most vulnerable to being labeled as criminal or deviant. Here you have an example where they look at one of the spray shooters and looking at his obsession with Call of Duty. So we'll see over and over that, certain types of behaviors are really demonized, certain music throughout history. This has also happened. And so along the dimensions of social power, we'll look at, those with the most capital or money generally have the privilege of getting to decide which groups and which behaviors are deviance. It also falls across racial and ethnic lines, as we've seen with so many drug laws throughout the United States. Gender can also play a role with it. So, for instance, we've seen women's sexuality very much demonized, even sex work. Even though it's men who generally are seeing sex workers, it's the workers who get demonized and not the people who are, paying them. We'll look at age and how young people oftentimes are framed as, again, the issue. Group affiliation. So again, those with power or those without power. So you'll see, if a particular religious affiliation or group has a lot of power. Christians in the US, they're the dominant religion. So you might see Christians demonizing another group, and it might be Christians that are demonized in another country. So you'll see it back and forth. It just depends on which group is dominant within the society. Those without an education, or those with a low social status in regards to like not having a lot of prestige or status within the culture. So you'll also find that these ideas intersect quite a bit as well, and that people without money who are black and young and have some kind of maybe stigmatizing social status would also be impacted the most.